Well, good evening. If you notice, we have a motley crew tonight. Uh, a great small crew. Um, it's because they're doing another family study group, so just continuing that conversation on what it looks like to minister to our families. And so tonight, we're just going to build off of what we talked about with Jesus wrapping up his concluding farewell address to his disciples, how he acknowledges that they're going to have to walk through a lot of difficult times, but as they do so, they're going to be able to do so knowing that God is with them. And that not only that, but Jesus, through his demonstration, coming, living a perfect life, dying on their behalf, and then rising from the dead, that they can have confidence that the things that he promised to them are not fluff, but they're real. They're things that can encourage them, to help them to endure and to persevere no matter what they're going through, no matter what we are going through. And tonight we're going to look in the Old Testament, where I think there's a story that really captures this. It's a story that, I don't know, imagine that you were, if you had to think about putting yourself in this story. As I read through it, it's one that most of us are going to know, but I just want you to think about it in terms of, what would you do? What would your thoughts be? What would your motives be? How do you think you would comply with this situation if you were giving these instructions in the circumstances in front of you? And just think about that with yourself. So, we're going to read the story of Jericho. You go into a new country. You're trying to go and actually complete a conquest. And as you get into the country, the first city that you see is Jericho. And starting in Joshua chapter 6, verse 1, we read, "Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites. No one leaving or entering. They've locked themselves into this building or into this fortress. They have fortified it. They have made it to where there's no way for them to get in and to attack them. They're also not going out. And the Lord said to Joshua, 'Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all of the men of war, circling the city one time, and do this for 6 days, having 7 priests carry 7 ram horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and while the priests blow the ram's horns. And when there is a prolonged blast of the horn, and you hear it sound, have all of the troops give a mighty shout, and then the city walls will collapse, and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead.' So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, 'Take up the Ark of the Covenant, and have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Lord.' He said to the troops, 'Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the Ark of the Lord.' And after Joshua had spoken to the troops," just pause there. Imagine you're in that circumstance. Like, you come into this new country. Your famed leader Moses didn't even get to go into the promised land with you. Instead, he actually just walked off into the wilderness to go die on a mountaintop. Like, he's led you for 40-something years, and now you're going into a new land. There's new leadership, Joshua, who's leading you in. You have this impossible circumstance that seems in front of you. Like, how are you going to overcome the obstacles? Are you going to go in and do what every fighting person would say? You're going to lay siege to the city. You're going to surround it. You're going to cut off food supplies. You're going to slowly just starve them out of the city that they're in. Like, what are you going to do? And God gives you the commands that you're going to march around the city, and then you're going to blow a horn, and then you're going to go home or back to camp. And then the next day you're going to get up and you're going to come and you're going to march around the city. You're going to blow a horn, go back to camp. And the next day, you're going to get up and do the same thing for 6 days. Like, you get to the end of the 6th day, and then what do? Well, if you're not already unmotivated, fatigued, doubting that this is actually going to work, doubting that God can do what he wants to, now you're going to go up to the city. You're going to march around it 7 times so that you're 7 times as tired as you would have been the early days. And as you march around it 7 times, you're going to blow the ram's horn. Everybody's going to shout, and just magically the walls are going to fall to the ground. Like, do you see how he's setting this situation up? It's like Gideon, like, going out against this huge army with 300 men. It's an impossible circumstance that if success actually comes, there's not going to be anyone that gets the glory except for God. And there's circumstances in front of them that if they should be obedient and God doesn't come through, they're going to look like idiots. Not only that, they're going to be exhausted and demoralized, and then still, are they going to try to lay siege then? I mean, what do you do at that point? Like, so imagine you're in their circumstances, and these are the orders that God gives you. We love to look at like the Israelites and say with them marching into the promised land, or, at the beginning of it, when they go to the promised land, they send in the spies, and the spies come back, and they're doubtful. Like, we'd love to think that we would be the people that would be like, no, let's go into the promised land. But there's sometimes that I look at like the instructions that God gave them as well. The instructions that he gives them don't seem to help build courage in the moment. Like, the instructions he's given them are not like awe-inspiring, who could have thought of these grand plan type instructions. And I think that a lot of times, while we don't have necessarily like Jericho that we can physically see, and like these plans that we're called to walk through that are just absurd, we do have circumstances in our lives where there are things happening outside of our control, and the command that God has given you and me is to trust them into his hands and to pray. And we'll think, how is that going to make the walls fall down? Like, there's a VeggieTale episode that shows the fall of Jericho. And like, you have the Israelites marching around, and the inhabitants of Jericho are up on top of the wall mocking them. And then you get back to camp, and the Israelites are struggling with it, and so all of these vegetables are running around deciding what they're going to do to try to conquer this city. Do we believe God and do what he says? Or then they like rig together this scrappy rocket over on the side, and are like, maybe we use this, we blow a hole in the wall. Like, that's silly. But there's so many times that when you and I are going through normal day-to-day life, we're doing the equivalent of that in our minds, where God's called us to do something faithful, and he's given us instructions on how to do it. Walk according to Jesus' ways. Do it in the fruit of the Spirit. Don't rely on your own strength or on wisdom. Trust God and his ways. Depend upon him. Wait for him. Seek his honor. Live according to his name. It doesn't matter if the outcome seems impossible to happen. If you do so, do it and trust God that he will make the walls fall down without you having to even touch them. And we subtly convince ourselves of the same thing. And we subtly doubt God's ability to accomplish what he's called us to. And we think he's going to fail us. But after they hear this, it says 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns. And go back one. 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved forward and blew the ram's horns. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. You know what the ark represented? The presence of God. The thing that Jesus was promising us would be with us always. Like, He's no longer sending us out as individuals who are going out and look back in there. That's where God's presence is, but that he promises us now every one of us goes out with the very presence of God in us. There are people that are like, it's like with the Holy Grail and all kinds of stuff. Indiana Jones makes a movie about it, and it's like, oh, we need this in our life. But the reality is that there's something so much better than an ark that represents God's presence now. And so Spirit with us. And so while the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priest who blew the ram's horns, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, do not shout or let your voice be heard. Do not let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say shout. And then you are to shout. So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once, and they returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took the ark of the Lord. And the 7 priests carrying the 7 ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. If you're thinking this is repetitive, why did they have to include it over and over in the Bible? Just imagine having to do it over and over for 6 days. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp, and they did this for 6 days. And early on the 7th day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. And after the 7th time, the priest blew the ram's horn, and Joshua said to the troops, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. But the city and everything in it are to be set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will be set apart, the camp of Israel, for destruction, and make trouble for it. And we know there's a story later on that comes where just that happened. For all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are to be dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. Well, I guess that's where we're stopping. They shout, and they blow the horns, and they're standing there, and without anything that's demonstrated in their own strength, the walls come tumbling down. I've had a situation very recently where I spent months trying to get a specific outcome, working on something. And finally coming to a point to where I just realized, I don't think I've ever fully just surrendered this to God and said, this is in your hands. And coming to a point to where I finally did that, and just prayerfully going to God and saying, this is in your hands. This is for you to accomplish. I hope you do. Help me to be faithful, whatever you do. And just spending several days praying that and willfully choosing to do that, to not let my mind run through all of the things that I needed to do, to not try to figure out there's some piece of the puzzle I haven't analyzed, but just willfully choosing, God, this is in your hands. And would you believe it, that it was after several of those days that something totally out of my control that I could not have changed wound up resulting in the very outcome I've been trying to get for months. This is something that's so easy for us to read an example and say, oh, there's distance between us and the Israelites who had to do that because we don't have any physical Jerichos in front of us. But the reality is you have plenty of spiritual ones, spiritual strongholds that Satan has, spiritual obstacles that are in your way, spiritual things that are out of your control to influence or to persuade. I mean, a very clear example of that is every other human being in this world that's not you. Like, do you have relational tensions? Do you have stuff that's going on between you and someone? The reality is you can't change that other person's heart. It's like a fortified city. It may even have fortified itself against you. And guess what? You can't make the walls come down by storming it. But you can just say, God, it's yours. And and commit yourself to doing what seems impossible, which is just to release it into his hands and let him do it, what only he can do. And then you can trust that in his timing, what needs to happen will happen. It may be days, it may be months, it may be years, but you can trust it into his hands. You see, in our weakness, God displays his strength and faithfulness. There may have been many ways that the Israelites could have overcome those walls, or maybe they couldn't have. I know in the New Testament there are plenty of times that God responds to his people in just such a way by actually not giving them exactly what they're asking in that moment and saying, my strength is made perfect in your weakness, for my grace is sufficient for you. And that's what we're called to. We're called to be children who depend on our Father. We're called to be children who show the world that our God is strong even when we are not. We're called to do that because ultimately it makes the people around us see that God is the answer, not you. And that's what we're called to make much of him. And so I just wanted to spend time in prayer. Are there things in your life that you have tried to retain up under your control, that you have tried to keep under your power, that you have tried to capture and to guarantee an outcome or result that ultimately you don't have the power to? And have you been doing that at the expense of actually just marching around you're that Israelite that runs out before everybody else and starts screaming at the wall and kicking it like it's going to do something. When in reality, what you need to do is just surrender and follow the plan that God has given for you, to be faithful, to walk in his ways, to do these things that he says are good and profitable for you to do that seem totally disconnected from actually accomplishing what you hope. You're walking around a wall and blowing a horn that has nothing to do with the good old stack of TNT that could blow up a wall. But he's not called you to do that. He's called you to walk around. Let's just spend time praying over that. Maybe there are things like that in your life that now would be a really good time to just say, God, this is in your hands, and I'm going to give it to you.